The dining room at the Langford Club went quiet, the way a room only goes quiet when something cruel is about to happen, and everyone in it is too polite to be the one who stops it. A hand had just closed around the arm of a woman seated alone at the window table, the good table, the one that looked out over the frozen ribbon of the Rideau Canal, and the hand belonged to a man who had decided, without a shred of evidence, that she did not belong there. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me now." Gavin Holcroft, duty manager, was certain he had read the situation correctly. He always was. He had spotted her the moment he came up from the wine cellar, a black woman in a charcoal blazer, sitting at a reserved table, with no visible escort, no membership pin. Nothing about her that fit the picture he carried in his head of who ate at the Langford on a Friday night in February. He expected an apology. He expected fluster. He expected her to gather her coat and shrink toward the door, while the members pretended not to watch. What Gavin Holcroft did not expect, what he could not have known as he tightened his grip, was that the silver-haired man who had stepped into the lobby 10 minutes earlier to take a phone call was already walking back toward the table, and he did not yet understand that he had just laid hands on one of the most decorated combat engineers in the Canadian Army, or that this small, ugly decision was about to end the only career he had ever cared about. The snow had been coming down over Ottawa since mid-afternoon, fat, lazy flakes that turned the streetlights along Sussex Drive into soft yellow halos. Inside the Langford Club, none of that weather reached you. The club was a converted limestone bank from the 1880s, all brass railings and oxblood leather and oil portraits of men who had been important enough, once, to have their faces hung on a wall. It smelled of wood smoke and old money and the particular mustiness of carpet that has soaked up a century of important conversations. People came here to be seen by the right people. Senators came. Deputy ministers came. A certain kind of Ottawa lawyer came to remind himself he had arrived. At the window table sat Lieutenant Colonel Chidera Nwosu, and she had earned that table more honestly than anyone else in the room. She was 46, though the steadiness in her eyes made her seem both younger and far older than that. She had been born in Port Harcourt, raised in Scarborough, and had joined the Canadian Forces at 19 because a recruiter at a job fair had treated her like she was worth something on a day when very few people did. 27 years later, she wore the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, commanded a combat engineer regiment, and carried inside her bonnet the small permanent souvenirs of 3 tours. A knee rebuilt after Kandahar, a hairline of scar tissue along her jaw from a vehicle rollover outside Riga, the slight hearing loss in her left ear that she never mentioned to the medical officer because she was not finished serving yet. Tonight, she wasn't a colonel. Tonight she was just Dara, in a blazer instead of combats, waiting on her old brigade commander to come back from a phone call so they could finish a quiet dinner. The occasion was a good one. Word had come down that week, unofficially, that she was being put forward for promotion to full colonel and a posting to the Strategic Joint Staff, the kind of appointment that meant the army had decided. She was one of the people it wanted in the room when hard decisions got made. Her dinner companion had insisted on celebrating. He had chosen the Langford because it was around the corner from National Defence Headquarters, and because, he said, the lamb was the best in the city. Major General Alistair Crewe had been her commanding officer in Afghanistan, back when she was a captain and he was a colonel, and the bond forged in that province does not loosen. He was somewhere out in the lobby now, 68 years old, and still ramrod straight, dressed in a plain dark suit, explaining to someone at the Pentagon's Canadian liaison desk why their timeline was unrealistic. He had been gone perhaps 8 minutes. 8 minutes was all it took. It began, as these things often do, with a smaller man's bad night. Gavin Holcroft had been duty manager at the Langford for 2 years and assistant manager for 6 before that. And in all that time, the corner office with the brass nameplate had never come open for him. He was 44. He had a mortgage in Barhaven he could barely service, and a wife who had stopped asking how his day went. 20 minutes before he laid eyes on Dara, a guest at the bar had walked out on a $400 tab. A florid businessman in a camel overcoat named Preston Vane, who had charmed the bartender, ordered a second bottle of Barolo, and then simply strolled out into the snow while the bartender was downstairs changing a keg. By the time anyone noticed, Vane was a set of fading footprints on Sussex Drive. Holcroft had been chewed out about it over the radio by the club's general manager, who told him in front of two waiters to find the problem and fix it. And so Gavin Holcroft, humiliated and looking for somewhere to put it, came up from the cellar, scanning the room, not for a man in a camel coat, but for someone who looked to him like trouble. His eyes slid right past the white guests. They stopped on the only black woman in the dining room. He approached the window table with his chest out. "Excuse me, are you a member here?" Dara looked up from her water glass. Her expression didn't change. She had a great deal of practice in not letting her expression change. "Good evening. I'm a guest of Major General Crew. We have the 7:30 reservation under his name." "I don't have any reservation under that," Holcroft said, which was a lie, or at least a thing he had not bothered to check. "Members don't leave their guests sitting alone. Where's the person who signed you in? He's taking a phone call in the lobby. He'll be back in a moment, and he'll be happy to confirm it." It was a calm, complete, perfectly reasonable answer, and that was exactly the problem. Gavin Holcroft did not want a reasonable answer. A reasonable answer left him standing there, with nowhere to put the ugliness of his evening. So he leaned in, lowered his voice to the register menus, when they want to threaten without being overheard, and said, "I think you should leave before this becomes a situation." A few heads at the nearby tables had begun to turn. A woman in pearls stopped her fork halfway to her mouth. Dara felt the old familiar heat climb the back of her neck. The feeling she'd had at the border crossing in Sarnia, at the car dealership in Halifax, at a dozen front desks where someone had looked at her uniform and her face and decided the two things couldn't go together. She set her water glass down without a sound. "Sir, I'm not going to leave. I have done nothing wrong. I'm waiting for the man who invited me, and when he returns, this will sort itself out. I'd ask you to step back and let me wait in peace. Don't tell me how to run my floor." Holcroft snapped, loud enough now that the soft jazz coming through the ceiling speakers seemed to thin out around the words. And then he made the call that would unmake him. He turned his head toward the bar and said, "Constable, over here, please," because the Langford, like a certain kind of establishment, kept a paid duty police officer in the building on busy weekend nights, posted by the Coke check in case a member had too much scotch and needed pouring into a taxi. Tonight that officer was Constable Kurt Brennan of the Ottawa Police Service, 14 years on the job, a man whose file in the professional standards section was already thicker than it should have been. Brennan was bored. He was getting paid $80 an hour to stand next to a coat rack, and a part of him had been waiting all night for a reason to do something. He came across the dining room with the unhurried, rolling walk of a man who likes the weight of his belt. "What's the trouble?" "This woman won't leave," Holcroft said. "She's not a member, she can't produce who signed her in, and she's becoming disruptive." Dara looked at the officer and made herself speak slowly, because she knew how these encounters were scored, and she knew the scoring was not fair. "Constable, my name is Chidera Nwosu. I'm a lieutenant colonel in the Canadian Armed Forces. I am the dinner guest of Major General Alistair Crew, who is currently in the lobby. There is no disturbance. There's a manager who has decided I don't belong and a reservation he hasn't bothered to look up. That's the entire situation." Brennan didn't write anything down. He didn't ask the manager to check the reservation book. He looked at the blazer and the calm voice and the dark face, and some lazy, sour instinct in him sorted her into a category. And once a man like Brennan has sorted you, the facts have to fight uphill the rest of the night. "I'm going to need to see some ID. May I ask on what grounds?" "I haven't been accused of a crime. I'm sitting at a table I was invited to." "The grounds are I'm asking," Brennan said. "You can show me ID and we sort this out quiet, or we can do it the hard way." Here is the thing the constable and the manager both failed to understand. The thing that Here is the thing they failed to understand about the woman in front of them. She had spent her adult life learning the precise architecture of authority. Who could lawfully order whom to do what, and when, and why. She had sat through more legal briefings on the rules of engagement than either man had had hot dinners. She knew to the letter that in Canada a person isn't required to identify herself to police merely because an officer wants her to. She knew the difference between a request and a detention. And she knew that a vague complaint from a man who hadn't checked his own booking system did not give Constable Brennan lawful authority over her body. "Constable," she said quietly, and the warmth had gone out of her voice now, replaced by something flat and very controlled. "Am I being detained?" Brennan's jaw worked. "Don't get smart with me. It's not a smart question. It's the only question. If I'm being detained, I'd like to know the offense you suspect. If I'm not being detained, then I'm a woman eating dinner, and you have no power to make me do anything. Which is it? The room had gone fully silent. The Pearls woman had her phone up now, screen glowing, recording at an angle. 2 tables over, a retired diplomat had stopped pretending to read his wine list. Holcroft, sensing the floor tilting under him, did the worst possible thing. He doubled down. She's resisting. Constable, just remove her. The club will back you. And Brennan, who had backed down from a confrontation exactly never in his career, reached down and took Lieutenant Colonel Nwosu by the upper arm, the way you'd grab a shoplifter, and pulled. On your feet now. She did not resist. She did not need to. She simply went rigid in the seat, her free hand flat on the white tablecloth, where everyone could see it was empty. Her eyes locked on the officers with an expression that was not fear, and was not even anger. It was the cold, clear pity of someone watching a man walk off a cliff he has been warned about. Take your hand off me, she said. You are making a mistake. You will not be able to walk back. You don't tell me. I'd do as the colonel, says Constable. The new voice did not shout. It didn't have to. It came from directly behind Brennan's shoulder, and it carried the gravel and the unanswerable calm of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms where his word was the last word spoken. Every head in the dining room turned toward it. Major General Alistair Crewe stood, with his phone still in his hand, and a stillness in him that was somehow louder than any raised voice could have been. He was a big man, 6'3", his silver hair cut close, his plain dark suit hiding the fact that the breast of it would, in uniform, be 3 rows deep in ribbons. He had heard the last 30 seconds from the archway. He had watched a police officer put hands on a soldier he had personally led through the worst fighting of the Kandahar campaign, a soldier he would have followed into any building, in any country on earth. Let go of her arm, Crewe said, and then I would like you to explain to me, slowly, why an Ottawa police officer is attempting to drag a serving lieutenant colonel of the Canadian Army out of a private dinner. Brennan let go. He did it without deciding to. There are some tones of voice the body obeys before the mind catches up, and that was one of them. He turned, the indignation already loading on his face, the speech about interfering with police business already half formed. And then he saw the man fully, and something in the bearing of him, the absolute lack of any doubt, made the words die in his throat. And who, Brennan managed, are you? Exactly, my name is Alistair Crewe. I'm a Major General in the Canadian Armed Forces. The reservation this gentleman couldn't find is under my name. I made it this morning. I came here tonight to celebrate the fact that this officer, he nodded toward Dara, who had not moved, has just been selected for promotion to colonel, after 27 years of service to this country, including 3 combat tours. And in the 8 minutes it took me to return a phone call, the 2 of you decided she was a thief. He let that sit for a moment in the silent room. So, tell me again about your grounds. Gavin Holcroft had begun very quietly to come apart. He could feel the evening reorganizing itself around him into a shape he would not survive. Sir, there was a guest who left without paying, earlier, a $400 tab, and the general manager told me to find the problem, Crewe finished for him. And out of an entire room, the problem you found was the only black woman in it. Was the guest who skipped the bill a black woman? Holcroft's silence was an answer. No, Crewe said. I didn't think so. It was Brennan he turned to last, and longest. Constable, you laid hands on a citizen who had committed no offence, who you had no lawful grounds to detain, on the word of a manager who hadn't checked his own reservation book. There's a half-dozen phones in this room that just recorded you doing it. Now, you're going to take out your own phone, and you're going to call your watch commander, and you're going to tell them what happened here tonight, before they hear it from someone else. Because I promise you, Constable, they are going to hear it from someone else. For a moment Brennan's hand drifted, out of pure habit, toward his belt, and Dara, who had been a still point through all of it, shifted her weight an inch, the smallest readiness, the kind of movement that takes years of training to make look like nothing. The general saw it and put a hand on her shoulder, not to restrain her but to tell her it was handled. The constable's hand fell away from his belt and went instead to his radio. But the general was already a step ahead. He raised his own phone, scrolled to a number with the unhurried ease of a man who had a great many useful numbers, and pressed it. The dining room was so quiet that the people at the nearest tables could hear it ring. Maeve, he said when it answered. Alistair Crewe. I apologize for the Friday night. No emergency. Well, that depends on your definition. His eyes never left Brennan's face. I'm at the Langford Club on Sussex. I'm sitting with one of my officers, and one of your constables has just physically grabbed her and tried to march her out of the building for the crime of eating dinner while black. There are several recordings. I thought you'd rather hear it from me first. He listened a moment, nodded once. His name tag says Brennan. Yes, I'll keep everyone right here. And Maeve. No cruisers with the lights going, please. We've ruined enough of these people's evening. He lowered the phone. To Brennan, he said, almost gently. That was Superintendent Maeve Donnelly. Professional standards. She and I sat on a community policing review board together for 3 years. She's sending a sergeant and she's coming herself. They were at a function 10 minutes from here. He slid the phone back into his jacket. You might want to use the time to think carefully about how you describe what just happened, because they're going to ask you and they're going to have the footage. Constable Kurt Brennan stood very still in the middle of the oxblood carpet, and for the first time in 14 years, the weight on his belt felt like exactly what it was, which was a borrowed authority he had just spent on the worst possible bet. The supervisors arrived within the quarter hour, and they arrived the way the general had asked. No lights, no sirens, just 2 unmarked vehicles pulling up through the falling snow, and 4 people coming in, out of the cold while the doorman held the heavy oak door. Superintendent Maeve Donnelly led them, a compact woman in a black overcoat, with frost still in her hair, her eyes doing a fast, professional sweep of the room and landing, in order, on the recording phones, the manager going grey by the bar, and finally on Constable Brennan, who would not meet her gaze. She crossed to the window table first. Lieutenant Colonel Nwosu. I'm Superintendent Donnelly. On behalf of the Ottawa Police Service, I'm sorry. You shouldn't have had to put up with this, and we're going to look at every minute of it. Then she turned, and the warmth left her face the way a light goes out. Constable, surrender your notebook to Sergeant Aldous and wait by the coat check. Don't speak to anyone. We'll do this properly downtown. That was the first turn of it, and the first turn is always the loudest, but it was not the end. In a story like this, the end takes months, and it grinds fine. Superintendent Donnelly did not go home that night. She went to the Elgin Street station and pulled Kurt Brennan's file, and what she found was not the file of an unlucky man who'd had one bad evening. It was the file of a pattern. Over 14 years, there had been 11 complaints, for arbitrary detentions, for carding, for a use of force on a teenager in Vanier that had been quietly settled, for 2 other incidents that smelled, when you laid them side by side, exactly like the one at the Langford. Different victims, same shape. They had a thing in common, those 11 complainants, and the thing was that not one of them had had the standing to make the complaint stick. They had been students, and newcomers, and a 16-year-old, and a man with a prior record, and people for whom it was Brennan's word against theirs, and a constable's word. The union always managed to remind everyone, carried a presumption. The complaints had been investigated and unfounded, investigated and withdrawn, investigated and buried under the soft grey snow of process. Brennan had learned the only lesson such a system can teach. He had learned he was untouchable. What he had failed to account for, leaning over that white tablecloth, was that this time the person he grabbed had standing the way a fortress has walls. This time the witness was a major general with a superintendent on speed dial. This time there were 11 phones. This time, as Donnelly muttered to her sergeants somewhere past 2 in the morning, the colonel could fight back, and behind her stood every voiceless person on the list who never could. The video went up the next afternoon. The Pearls woman, it turned out, was a retired CBC producer, and she knew exactly how to hand footage to a newsroom. By Sunday night, it had been watched 4 million times. By Monday, it had a name. People were calling it dining, while decorated, and the comments underneath it ran, as comments do, the whole range of the human heart. Most of them were sick with recognition. This happens every day to people without a general at the table, one said. And it climbed to the top of the thread, because everyone underneath it knew the worst part of the story was the truest part. That the only reason it had ended the way it did was that the woman in the chair, this one time, had outranked the men standing over her. Without the general, without the superintendent, without the 4 million views, Lieutenant Colonel Chidera Nwosu would have been a line in a notebook and a problem that got removed. Dara knew it too. When the Army's public affairs people asked if she'd give a statement, she gave them exactly 4 sentences, and the last one was the one the country remembered. "I had a major general standing behind me," she said. "Most people don't. The day a person needs that just to finish their dinner in peace is the day we should all be ashamed, and we should fix the thing, not just punish the man." The thing and the man both got their reckoning. The man's came in stages. The Special Investigations Unit declined the file. No serious injury, but professional standards did not, and neither did the Crown. Kurt Brennan was suspended within the week, and the 11 old complaints, dusted off and lined up by a superintendent who had stopped being willing to look away, became the spine of a disciplinary hearing under the Police Services Act. He was found to have engaged in unlawful arrest and discreditable conduct. The hearing officer, a retired judge with a long memory, wrote a decision people in the service still quote, in which she observed that the charter does not have an asterisk that reads, unless the officer is in a hurry, or in a bad mood, or has already decided. Section 9, she wrote, protects everyone from arbitrary detention, and a constable who detains a citizen on a hunch dressed up as a description has not made an honest mistake. He has substituted his prejudice for the law he swore to serve. Brennan was dismissed. He lost the pension he'd been 4 years from collecting, and because the dismissal report named the pattern, not just the night. The Crown laid a charge of unlawful confinement that he eventually pleaded out, taking a conditional sentence and a permanent end to any law enforcement career in the country. Gavin Holcroft lasted 19 days. The Langford Club, watching its century of careful reputation evaporate in a weekend, did what institutions do when they're frightened. It threw him overboard fast and called it accountability. But the human rights complaint that Dara filed, almost reluctantly, after a long talk with the general about whether she had the energy for it, did not let the club off so cleanly. At the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, the club's lawyers wanted to argue one rogue manager, one bad apple, and the adjudicator wouldn't have it. The evidence showed 3 prior incidents of racialized guests being challenged about their right to be on the premises, all unrecorded, all smoothed over with a complimentary bottle and a quiet word. The tribunal found discrimination, ordered damages, and, more lasting than the money, ordered the club to rebuild its policies and train its staff under outside supervision, with a report due every quarter for 3 years. The brass nameplate on the duty manager's office was changed. So, eventually, was the kind of person the Langford was willing to put behind it. And the businessman in the camel coat, the one whose unpaid $400 tab had set the whole grim machine in motion. Preston Vane was traced within a day through his credit card pre-authorization, sent a demand letter, and paid up by e-transfer with an apology that fooled no one. He had been the actual problem in the room. He had walked out the front door past Gavin Holcroft's own eyes, and Holcroft, given a real thief and a black woman eating dinner, had chased the wrong one with everything he had. There was a lesson in that the size of the whole country, and a great many people, watching the footage, understood that they had seen it before and would, unless something changed, see it again. 11 weeks after the night at the Langford, in a small ceremony at National Defence Headquarters, with snow still clinging to the windows, Chidera Nwosu was promoted to the rank of colonel. Major General Alistair Crewe pinned the new rank to her shoulders himself, his hands steady, his eyes not entirely dry. There were no cameras. She had asked for none. When a reporter caught her afterward in the parking lot and asked how it felt to be vindicated, she stopped and thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything, and said it didn't feel like vindication. It felt like a debt. There are 11 people in that constable's file, she said, and a tribunal full of names before mine, who carried this for years and got nothing for it but a closed case. If my rank is good for anything, it's good for making sure the next person doesn't need a rank to be believed. Then she got in her car and drove back to her regiment, because she had soldiers waiting and a country to keep serving, and the spotlight had never once been the point. So here is what's worth carrying out of a story like this one. And it isn't the satisfying part, though the satisfying part is real. The disgraced constable, the gutted club, the cold machinery of justice finally turning the right way. The deeper thing is the part Colonel Nwosu kept pointing at, even when it would have been easier to take the win and go home. A badge, a title, a uniform. These are meant to be a trust held on behalf of everyone, especially the people who have none of those things to hide behind. The moment that trust gets turned into a weapon against the very people it's supposed to protect, it stops being authority and becomes only cruelty in a costume. The two men at the Langford bet that a quiet woman alone at a table would be too small to fight back. They were wrong about her, and they were lucky, in a way, that they were wrong, because her standing is the only reason the rot ever got dragged into the light. The harder question, the one she left hanging over 4 million screens, is what happens to all the people who never have a general walking back from the lobby. That's the part that's left to us. So tell me, honestly, if there had been no major general at that table that night, do you believe the story would have ended any differently? Sit with that one. And if it moved something in you, leave your answer in the comments, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Voices of Courage, where we tell the true-spirited stories of ordinary people who refuse to be made small. Because the next voice that needs lifting up might just be the one sitting quietly at the table next to yours.